In last week's video I showed you what the grey house looked like when I bought it and talked about the plans. So this time I'm going to work through what actually happened structurally, starting downstairs because that's where most of the main work was. Before I even started taking walls down, I had to work out what was supporting what. If you overlay the plans, you can see the walls don't line up at all. I grew up in a 1930s house and most of the places I've lived in are Victorian. In those houses, walls tend to sit on top of each other, but not here. It took me ages looking at the plans to realise that the scales are actually wrong. Lining up the vertical external walls shows this chimney breast in the middle of the bathroom, so something is very wrong. But even using the plan horizontally, nothing lined up. I genuinely couldn't work out what was load bearing, so I ended up grabbing the circular saw and cutting a hole in the lounge floor to see which way the joists run. Once I knew the joist direction, I started measuring downstairs walls and cutting inspection holes all over the place. There were so many holes in the lounge it got dangerous and I ended up having to reboard the whole thing. Once I understood the structure, I got building control approval for the major alterations. New windows, removing walls, adding a toilet where the extra back door was, 2 new en-suites and running a new drain from the house to one of the rear manholes. I'd assumed services came in from the front, but nothing that simple. In another video I talk about checking your deeds, and this is a classic example. You would assume the services and drains come in from the front road. When the house was built they made the same assumption and actually had to buy this extra 30 foot from the people in the house behind because the council insisted their services came in from the bottom lane. Then I had a structural engineer in, ordered the steel and started taking down walls. I don't have photos of removing the bathroom wall because it was insignificant structurally, but in the middle bedroom I knocked out all the brick-built wardrobes which were the whole length of this wall and nearly 3 foot deep. That instantly turned the middle room from a single into a decent sized double. I discovered that this wall and the shared wardrobe between these bedrooms wasn't supporting the joists at all and obviously had no wall above, so I could remove it without extra support. Then I hired acros, supported the ceiling and took out this wall myself. I paid the steel company to insert timber either side of the beams so I could refix the joists with hangers. They delivered and put the beam in place. I then used hangers and attached the existing joists, so by the end of it I had a hole in the ceiling and rooms that finally made best use of the space. As I've mentioned, I removed the wall between the tiny bathroom and the boiler room and took out the boiler, which was a job in itself. While this was happening, I also removed as much of the old heating ducts as possible. Because the bathroom was internal, I needed an extractor fan. The chimney breast went up through that space and building control allowed me to vent into the chimney rather than having to run through the bedrooms, which made everything much neater. I carefully worked out the bathroom layout because I wanted to put a really nice big bath in there. I found a lovely double-ended 180cm long bath. To put in a luxury walk-in shower I had to channel across the concrete floor, not something I enjoyed. And while we're talking bathrooms, I also added an extra downpipe in the separate toilet so I could have an ensuite in the room above. It all looked fine when it was boxed in. Upstairs there was less structural change, but I do laugh at myself when I say less went on up there, as I took down all the plasterboard to insulate the walls. In terms of structural work though, the fireplace drove me mad. When I first removed the 1950s fire, I realised the flue was off-centre because it served downstairs as well. Why there was a flue downstairs, I have no idea. I sat and looked at this for a week trying to figure out how to make it work. There was no way I was leaving the fire off-centre. So I ended up cutting into the floor and ceiling, building up a pillar, installing a new lintel and cutting back the brickwork on the right-hand side to widen the opening. That way I created a centralised recess for the new stove and put in a false wall to the left to balance it up. In the kitchen I removed the remaining stub wall and pantry to open up the space properly. I cut out the windows to insert French doors into the garden. building control insisted on a 6x3 timber beam above the hole, even though the roof was lightweight and there was already a lintel. Getting that timber into place without compromising the opening was a nightmare. I converted the unnecessary third back door porch into a guest toilet. It was funny. The new PVC windows arrived before I got to that, so I had the window installed first and then built the wall around it. I put in a spur, raised the floor, boarded it out, and reused one of the many spare internal doors from downstairs. Moving to the outside jobs, for the new ensuite in the big bedroom downstairs, we had to run a soil pipe under the concrete raft and then trench it about 120 metres down the drive. I brought in contractors for that, and I am so glad I did. When they tried to go under the house, they hit reinforced concrete with granite, evidence of previous underpinning due to subsidence on the clay hill. They started with a handheld breaker and eventually had to bring in a larger attachment for the mini digger, and even then it struggled. As you can tell, I try and do everything I possibly can myself, but sometimes it's really good to get somebody else to do a job. Now, before I get to the garage roof, the balcony. I always knew the balustrade had to go. It was ugly and felt unsafe. The back of the house also had those horrible decorative concrete blocks that I hated as a parapet wall by the front door. I did question whether 18-inch concrete slabs were sensible on that balcony roof. It seemed a really heavyweight solution, and I wasn't sure the timbers had been spec'd for that sort of weight. I stripped back everything and exposed the old felt roof when the weather forecast was really good. But of course, 3 days into the job, the forecast changed and I ended up having to shroud the house to protect the bedrooms, which had just been plastered. I rebuilt it properly, incorporating the original hidden gutter that had been ignored. I used tannalized boards that were still imperial size, so they fitted perfectly. I laid a rubber layer, turned up the edges to seal the joints, but obviously couldn't leave it like that. You wouldn't want heels walking on the rubber roofing. I did consider decking, but eventually went for external vinyl, realising that as the weather hit that side of the house, it would need replacing every few years. Then the balustrade. I'd originally wanted to do a single span of glass because of the amazing view, but that would have put the price up to £18,000 just for the glass. So I opted for 2 sections, which still came in at over £10,000 and was shipped from Ireland. A local aluminium specialist installed base plates, uprights and rubberized clamps with matching box-sectioned handrails. We repeated the design at the back of the house, down the steps into the car park, and it completely changed the feel of the house. The main roof itself was originally extruded copper sheet, later covered in green roofing felt. It hadn't failed, but as I've said, it looked like a shed. Because the joists were lightweight, I was severely limited in choice. I couldn't add heavy tiles or slate, and I was advised that imitation slate was prone to warp in the sun. I eventually chose a rubber roof and paid a company to install it properly. They recommended reboarding with marine ply to create a smooth surface before laying the rubber, and did a fabulous job. The garage was a different story. It had shingles that had rotted through. I stripped them off and shrouded the garage for a few months to let the timber dry. Now, I'm not really good at using PSE, but with all the creepy crawlies in that roof, I gave in. I cut back the rotten joist ends, spliced the new timber, then boarded it and laid the rubber myself. It was immensely satisfying. So that was the heavy structural phase. Looking back, it was a huge job, but you don't always realise at the time quite what you have achieved. It was all worth it though. In the next video, I'll show you how it all came back together and what it finally looked like.